Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the strangest, most elusive, and downright mysterious aspects of the Chaos Space Marines, the warbands that history itself seems to have forgotten. When people think about the traitor legions, names like the Black Legion, World Eaters, or Death Guard come to mind, legendary forces that carved their names into history with fire and blood. But not every warband of the Dark Gods has had the same fate. Some warbands disappeared entirely, their names erased from records, their warriors scattered across the endless war zones of the galaxy. Others were swallowed by the tides of the warp, consumed by madness, or simply faded into obscurity, their ambitions lost to the cold void of time. And that raises a fascinating question. Why were these Chaos Space Marine warbands forgotten? Was it because they were weak? Were they crushed by rivals? Or is it possible that some of them are still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Today, we're diving deep into the lost warbands of chaos, uncovering their forgotten legacies and trying to piece together what really happened to these warriors of darkness. The lost Chaos Space Marine warbands are one of the biggest enigmas in the Warhammer 40k universe. Unlike the infamous legions that dominate the battlefield, these warbands have, for one reason or another, vanished from recorded history. Some were wiped out in battle, others fell apart due to infighting or betrayal, and some simply disappeared into the warp, never to be seen again. But the truth is, there's no single explanation for why a warband becomes forgotten. Every case is different, and that's what makes them so fascinating. One of the most common reasons a warband fades into obscurity is sheer annihilation. Chaos is ruthless. And unlike the Imperium, which at least pretends to care about its armies, the Dark Gods have no use for failure. If a warband loses a crucial battle or proves too weak to hold its own, it's often wiped out entirely. Maybe the Imperium exterminated them. Maybe they were crushed by a rival warband, or maybe their own patron god abandoned them, leaving them to die screaming in the void. In the 41st millennium, war is constant, and only the strongest, or the most cunning, manage to carve out a legacy. But not all lost warbands were destroyed in battle. Some were undone by the very nature of chaos itself. Unlike the loyalist Space Marines, who at least have the rigid structure of the Codex Astartes to keep them in line, Chaos warbands are held together by sheer force of will, ambition, and sometimes sheer terror. If a leader dies or loses their grip on power, the entire warband can implode. Warriors turn on each other, splitting into smaller factions or being absorbed into stronger groups. Many warbands that once operated independently may now exist only as nameless squads within larger chaos forces, their banners abandoned, their identities erased. Then there's the matter of isolation. The galaxy is a vast, uncaring place, and it's entirely possible that some chaos warbands simply disappeared into the void, whether by accident or design. Some may have ventured too deep into the Eye of Terror or another warp-infested region, becoming lost in time, twisted beyond recognition, or even trapped in a realm where reality itself is breaking apart. Others might have deliberately cut themselves off, either as part of some long-forgotten scheme or because they sought something greater than mere war. There are even theories that some warbands turned their backs on the Dark Gods altogether, attempting to escape their fate, though whether they succeeded or were torn apart by their former masters remains unknown. And then there are those who were simply absorbed. Chaos is a brutal, competitive existence, and only the most powerful warbands retain their identities over the millennia. We know that the Black Legion, for example, grew by consuming smaller warbands, taking in shattered remnants of the traitor legions and forging them into something stronger. How many once proud Chaos warbands were simply swallowed by a larger force, their warriors repainted, their names forgotten? How many commanders who once dreamed of carving out their own empires were forced to kneel before someone stronger? But the most intriguing possibility? Some warbands didn't vanish at all. They're still out there, hidden in the dark corners of the galaxy, waiting. Maybe they were never truly lost, just biding their time, preparing for a moment when they can rise again. And if that's the case, then who knows what horrors might still be lurking in the shadows of chaos? Some Chaos Space Marine warbands don't just fade away. They dissolve into something far worse. The warp is not just a battleground, it's a living, breathing nightmare, a place where time, identity, and reality itself become meaningless. And some warbands, either by accident or design, have completely disappeared into its depths. These are the ones that were swallowed whole, their warriors transformed into something beyond mortal understanding. For some, this fate is a punishment. The Chaos Gods are not merciful, and those who fail them often meet a fate worse than simple death. Warbands that strayed too close to the Eye of Terror, or that dabbled in powers they couldn't control, may have been consumed entirely, either ripped apart by demonic entities or forced to merge with them. Some might have entered a warp storm and never come back, their ships lost in a swirling void where the laws of physics no longer apply. Did they die? Did they become something else? No one knows. What's even more terrifying is that time doesn't work the same way in the warp. Some of these lost warbands might still be fighting battles that, in real space, ended thousands of years ago. Or worse, they might emerge tomorrow, unchanged but filled with horrors beyond imagination. Others, however, embraced the warp willingly. There are tales of warbands that sought apotheosis, not just for their champions, but for every single warrior among them. They didn't just fight alongside demons, they became them. Imagine an entire warband of space marines ascending to demonhood, their flesh twisting, their souls forever bound to the Chaos Gods. If that happened, would they even be considered space marines anymore? Or would they be something else entirely, creatures of pure nightmare, no longer bound by their old allegiances or even their own sense of self? Some of the most disturbing theories suggest that certain warbands never truly vanished, but instead merged with the very fabric of the warp itself. Maybe they became part of a demon world, their bodies fused with the shifting landscapes of chaos, their consciousness forever trapped in a realm where thought and reality are indistinguishable. Some whisper that there are places in the warp where the souls of entire legions still scream, their suffering endless, their identities erased as they become nothing more than fuel for the dark gods. And then there are the stories of warbands that didn't disappear, but instead changed so drastically that no one recognizes them anymore. What if some of the demon hosts we see today, those monstrous twisted legions that descend upon real space like storms of madness, were once actual space marines? What if those hulking demon engines, those possessed abominations, were once warriors who simply lost themselves in the corruption of the warp? This is what makes the Lost Warbands so terrifying. They're not just names that faded from history, they are warnings. Warnings that the line between a Chaos Space Marine and a daemon is thinner than most would like to admit. Warnings that no warband is truly safe from the hunger of the warp. And warnings that some of them may yet return, no longer human, no longer even Space Marines, but something infinitely worse. Some Chaos Space Marines never found a home. When the Horus Heresy tore the Imperium apart, most of the traitor legions had a clear path, either joining the War Master's Grand Rebellion or, after his fall, carving out their own domains in the Eye of Terror. But not every Astartes who turned against the Emperor managed to claim a place in this new order. Some fell through the cracks, drifting without purpose, rejected by both Chaos and their former brothers. These are the forgotten traitors, the ones who never truly belonged anywhere. The reasons for their exile vary. Some were simply too weak to survive the brutal infighting that followed the heresy. Without powerful warlords to rally behind, these lost warriors were forced into a nomadic existence, scavenging what they could, fighting battles just to stay alive. Others were betrayed by their own kind, cast out by stronger warbands that saw them as liabilities or rivals. There are even cases where entire squads or companies were abandoned during a campaign, left to die in the void, only to claw their way back, bitter and vengeful, but without a place to call home. Then there are the ones who never fully committed to Chaos in the first place. Some Astartes turned against the Imperium, not because they believed in the Dark Gods, but because they felt betrayed by the Emperor, by their Primarchs, or by the Imperium's cold indifference. These warriors had no interest in worshipping the ruinous powers, but after turning traitor, they had nowhere else to go. The Imperium would never take them back, and the legions of Chaos saw them as weaklings, unworthy of their gifts. So they wandered, never truly belonging to either side, fighting only for their own survival. Some of these exiles operate as mercenaries, selling their skills to the highest bidder. Chaos warbands, rogue traitors, even Xenos factions. Anyone desperate enough for elite warriors might be willing to strike a deal. There are rumors of former Astartes fighting for Drakari raiding parties, joining Corsair fleets, or even serving as enforcers in criminal empires. Of course, such arrangements never last long. Chaos Space Marines are built for war, not loyalty. They might fight for coin or resources for a time, but sooner or later, they always end up in battle, driven by the only purpose they have left. Others try to forge their own path, forming tiny, forgotten warbands that barely qualify as armies. These groups rarely make history. They don't have the strength to rival the Black Legion or the World Eaters, and they lack the numbers to conquer worlds. Instead, they survive on the fringes, preying on the weak, scavenging from the dead, and striking only when the odds are in their favor. Some dream of one day rising to power, carving out their own empire in the darkness of the void. But most of them will die long before that dream ever becomes a reality. There's also the idea that some of these exiles still cling to the belief that they were right to rebel, but they refuse to see themselves as servants of chaos. They hate the Imperium, but they also see what chaos has done to their former brothers and want no part of it. What do you do when you have no home, no allies, and no cause worth fighting for? Some of these lost Astartes simply keep fighting with no grand strategy or endgame, just an endless cycle of war. It's possible that some of these exiles might one day return, either by force or by desperation. A warband that has spent centuries in obscurity, gathering strength in the shadows, could emerge as a new threat, taking advantage of the galaxy's chaos to make their mark. Or maybe they'll just fade away, their names lost to time, remembered only in half-whispered rumors of warriors who once fought but never belonged. The brutal reality of chaos is that weakness is never tolerated. Unlike the Imperium, where even failure can sometimes be forgiven if it serves a greater purpose, chaos has no patience for those who fall behind. Warbands that show even a hint of weakness, whether through poor leadership, internal division, or simple bad luck, are doomed to be crushed, consumed, or erased from existence. The galaxy is littered with the bones of Chaos Space Marines who thought they could carve out a place for themselves, only to be utterly destroyed by their own kind. The warbands that disappear due to failure often meet one of three fates. Some are outright annihilated in battle, too weak to hold their ground against stronger rivals. The warp is full of stories of chaos lords who overestimated their strength, leading their forces into doomed wars against greater warbands, daemon hosts, or even loyalist counterattacks. The Imperium may fear chaos, but it is still an empire of overwhelming military power, and when it decides to exterminate a warband, it doesn't hold back. If a chaos warband isn't strong enough to resist, it is simply erased from history. No legends, no survivors, just another name lost in the endless war. Others are swallowed whole by stronger forces. The Black Legion is the most famous example of this. Having absorbed countless warbands over the millennia, Abaddon doesn't tolerate weakness, but he is more than willing to give remnants of broken warbands a second chance, so long as they submit to his rule. Many lesser warbands have lost their identity this way, their warriors repainted in the colors of the War Master's legions, their former leaders executed or reduced to nameless champions within a much, much greater force. It's easy to imagine how many once independent warbands have been completely erased this way, their banners burned, their names forgotten, their histories rewritten to serve Abaddon's glory. But not all failures lead to death. Some warbands collapse from within, torn apart by infighting, betrayal, or sheer madness. Chaos is not a stable force. It thrives on ambition, destruction, and constant struggle. Even among traitor Astartes, alliances are temporary, and the moment one warrior sees an opportunity to rise above his brothers, the knives come out. There have been warbands that imploded before they even had the chance to make a name for themselves, their leaders torn apart by rival factions, their warriors turning on one another in a desperate bid for dominance. In the end, these warbands don't even leave behind ruins or legends, just another footnote in the long history of self-destruction that defines chaos. Some fans speculate that certain lost warbands might still exist, not as independent forces, but as fractured remnants hiding within larger legions. A warrior from a defeated warband might still fight, still carry the scars of his former allegiance, but with no name, no history, nothing to show for the battles he fought. There could be warriors in the ranks of the Wordbearers, the Night Lords, or even the Red Corsairs, who once belonged to a warband that no longer exists. They wear different colors now, follow a different master, but deep down, they remember what they lost. It's also worth considering the possibility that some warbands never truly disappeared, but instead changed so much that they became unrecognizable. A force that started as a proud chaos warband might, over centuries, become something else entirely. A mercenary band, a roving cult, or even a pirate fleet with no loyalty to chaos at all. Maybe they lost faith in the dark gods, or maybe they simply adapted to survive. Either way, the warbands that fail are not always erased. Sometimes, they just become something new, something that no longer fits into the narrow definition of what a Chaos Space Marine warband is supposed to be. In the end, history is written by the victors. The warbands that succeed become legends, while those that fail are forgotten. But for every warband that fell in battle, that was crushed by a greater power, or that simply ceased to exist, there is always the possibility that some part of them still lingers, waiting, hiding, or planning their revenge. Not every Chaos Space Marine stays loyal to chaos. That might sound strange. After all, these warriors turned their backs on the Emperor, abandoned their oaths, and embraced the darkness of the warp. But chaos is not a single entity. It's an endless, shifting storm of ambition, betrayal, and madness. Some warriors, after witnessing the true horror of chaos, decide they want nothing more to do with it. The problem is, once you've sworn yourself to the dark gods, there's no easy way out. For some, the realization comes too late. They thought chaos would give them freedom, power, purpose, but instead they found only chains of mutation, of unbreakable oaths, of eternal torment. The gifts of chaos always come at a price, and not everyone is willing to pay it forever. Some Chaos Space Marines, realizing that they have been deceived, try to break free. Some simply disappear, vanishing into the void, hoping to escape their fate. Others go further, turning against their former masters and waging a war against the very gods they once served. But renouncing chaos is not as simple as walking away. The dark gods do not forgive, and their followers are even less merciful. A Chaos Marine who tries to abandon their path is marked for death, hunted relentlessly by their former brothers. Some manage to go into hiding, slipping through the cracks of the galaxy, disappearing into backwater worlds where no one will find them. Others try to forge new identities, disguising themselves as mercenaries, pirates, or even joining rogue human forces. But the corruption of chaos never truly leaves. Whether it's the whispers in their mind, the mutations hidden beneath their armor, or the cursed knowledge they carry, they are forever tainted. The Imperium would never take them back. They are outcasts in every sense of the word. There are stories of entire warbands that turned against chaos, deciding that they would rather die fighting their former gods than serve them any longer. Some fan theories suggest that certain rogue Astartes forces, the ones that don't fit neatly into either the Imperium or Chaos, could actually be made up of these exiles. Maybe some of those mysterious, unaffiliated Space Marines that pop up in scattered reports, warriors who refuse to name their allegiance, are actually former Chaos Space Marines trying to escape their past. But the question remains, what happens to those who turn their backs on chaos? Do they have a future, or are they just delaying the inevitable? Some believe that even if they reject the gods, they are still bound to them. The warp has a way of pulling back those who try to run. Maybe they get drawn into some forgotten war, fighting in the shadows for centuries, never truly free. Maybe they become something worse, monsters trapped between two worlds, no longer Astartes but not yet fully consumed by the demonic. Or maybe, just maybe, some of them do find a way out. It's a tragic fate, really. They betrayed the Imperium, only to realize that chaos is just as cruel, if not worse. They tried to fight for something greater, only to end up as hunted outcasts, with no home, no brothers, and no future. Some might seek redemption, even if they know it's impossible. Others might simply fight until they can fight no more. hoping that, in death, they will finally escape the grasp of the gods. But if there's one thing that's certain, it's that the galaxy doesn't forget. Whether they hide in the depths of space, masquerade as something they're not, or wage their own personal war against chaos, these exiles are still out there. And who knows? Maybe one day, one of them will return, bringing with them a knowledge that could shake the foundations of both the Imperium and the warp itself. Not every Chaos Warband is out to carve its name into history. Some don't seek conquest, glory, or the favor of the dark gods. They aren't trying to become the next Black Legion or raise demon worlds in their name. They simply fight to survive, existing in the shadows of the galaxy, unnoticed by the Imperium and even by chaos itself. These are the Nameless Warbands, the ones that never sought fame or recognition. Just another group of lost warriors trying to make it through the endless war. It's easy to assume that every Chaos Space Marine is driven by ambition, that every warband wants to become the next great power in the Eye of Terror. But that's just not the case. For every legendary warlord who rises to prominence, there are a dozen others who don't care about the grand game of chaos. Some warbands never had the numbers or strength to be anything more than raiders, scavengers, or nomadic killers. Maybe they were remnants of larger forces that shattered long ago. Or maybe they were always small, a single warband, a handful of warriors, surviving in the void because they have no other choice. These are the warbands that move through the cracks of the galaxy, never drawing enough attention to be hunted, never making enough of an impact to be remembered. They don't launch massive crusades, they don't challenge the Imperium head-on, and they don't seek the blessings of the gods in the same way their more ambitious counterparts do. Instead, they move like ghosts, hitting small targets, raiding isolated outposts, and slipping away before anyone can take notice. Some might see this as cowardice, but in reality, it's just another way to survive. Chaos is brutal, and warbands that grow too fast, make too much noise, or attract the wrong kind of attention usually don't last long. The Black Legion absorbs them, rival warbands tear them apart, or worse, the Imperium actually cares enough to wipe them out. Staying small, staying quiet, staying out of the endless wars between greater powers, that's how some Chaos Space Marines have lasted for millennia without being crushed. Then there are the ones who simply don't care about chaos in the way others do. They aren't zealous worshippers of the dark gods. They aren't trying to earn favor or ascend to daemonhood. Maybe they don't even believe in the gods at all, despite what they've seen. To them, chaos isn't a cause, it's just the reality they live in. They fight because fighting is all they know. They raid because they need supplies. They kill because, in this galaxy, killing is the only way to keep breathing. Some fans speculate that there are entire warbands that have drifted so far from chaos that they barely even resemble their former selves. Imagine a group of Astartes who left their legion centuries ago, no longer wearing its colors, no longer following its traditions, and no longer caring about its past. They still fight, but not for any grander purpose, just to keep going, just to survive another cycle of bloodshed. If you came across them, would you even recognize them as Chaos Space Marines anymore? Or would they just be another group of nameless killers lost in the endless wars of the galaxy? In a way, these forgotten warbands are the most tragic of all. They don't have a cause, they don't have a future, they don't even have a real identity anymore. They exist in the margins of history, never important enough to be remembered, never strong enough to rise, never weak enough to be completely destroyed. They are the ghosts of chaos, and they will fight until the day they finally fade away, unnoticed and forgotten. Not every Chaos Warband fights for glory on the battlefield. Some don't even want to be seen at all. There are whispers of groups that never declared themselves openly, never raised their banners for the galaxy to see. They work from the shadows, weaving schemes so deep and so subtle that even the Imperium barely knows they exist. These are the hidden cult orders of chaos, the warbands that abandoned open war in favor of something far more insidious. Unlike the legions that revel in destruction, these groups play the long game. They don't charge headfirst into battle, screaming oaths to the dark gods. Instead, they infiltrate, manipulate, and pull the strings of those who don't even realize they're being controlled. Some of them operate within the Imperium itself, embedding their influence in noble houses, planetary governments, even the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes. There are theories that some successor chapters of Loyalist Space Marines might have been slowly twisted by these hidden cults, their traditions subtly rewritten over generations, turning them into something unrecognizable before they even realize what's happening. Then there are those who work in the shadows of chaos itself, orchestrating events that even other warbands don't fully understand. Chaos is a chaotic force by nature. Warbands rise and fall constantly, leaders are overthrown, alliances shift like sand in the warp. But what if some of those collapses weren't just random? What if some of the forgotten warbands didn't fail naturally, but were systematically dismantled by unseen hands? It's entirely possible that some of these cult orders don't serve just one chaos god, or even chaos as a whole, but instead follow their own twisted agendas, using the powers of the warp as tools rather than as objects of worship. Some fan theories go even deeper, suggesting that certain ancient warbands may have discovered something within the warp that even the chaos gods don't want to be known. Perhaps they stumbled upon secrets buried since the days of the Horus Heresy, forbidden knowledge that made them a threat to both the Imperium and the forces of chaos alike. If that were true, it would explain why they stay hidden, why they never reveal themselves fully. Maybe they aren't forgotten at all. Maybe they've deliberately erased their own existence, ensuring that no one even knows where to look. There are rumors of warbands that function more like secret societies than traditional armies, recruiting only the most elite warriors, gathering knowledge rather than territory, building influence rather than strongholds. Imagine a chaos warband that has no homeworld, no identifiable insignia, no grand war cry, only whispered names appearing in the records of dead men and forgotten battles. They could be anywhere, working from behind the scenes, altering the course of history without ever revealing their hand. And that's what makes them so terrifying. The warbands that openly declare their allegiance to chaos are dangerous, yes, but at least you can see them coming. These hidden orders, you wouldn't even know they were there until it was too late. Maybe they've already shaped the Imperium in ways we can't even begin to imagine. Maybe they've been pulling the strings of chaos itself for longer than anyone realizes. And maybe, just maybe, they're still waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows and show the galaxy what they've really been planning all along. History is cruel, even to the warriors of chaos. Some warbands fought, bled, and conquered, only to have their names washed away in the endless tide of war. These aren't the warbands that fell in glorious battle, nor the ones that turned against their own gods. These are the ones that simply faded, their banners lost, their identities erased, their legacies absorbed into something greater, or simply forgotten entirely. Chaos doesn't care for tradition the way the Imperium does. The Space Marines of the Loyalist chapters record every battle, every hero, every fallen brother in their endless tomes of honor. But chaos? Chaos is change. Warbands rise and fall like waves crashing against the shore. What might have once been a proud and independent force could, over centuries, dissolve into something unrecognizable. Some warbands were swallowed by larger legions, their warriors repainted, their old leaders discarded or absorbed into the hierarchy of their new masters. Maybe a warband that once fought under the banner of the Night Lords now wears the colors of the Red Corsairs, their original identity erased as they swore themselves to Huron Blackheart. Then there are those that changed their names and became something else entirely. Chaos doesn't have the rigid structure of the Imperium, where a chapter's name and traditions are set in stone. If a warband suffers a devastating defeat, if their leader is killed, or if they simply decide that their old identity no longer serves them, they can become something new. Some might see this as cowardice, a way of escaping their failures. Others see it as evolution, a necessary adaptation to survive in a galaxy where only the strong endure. How many famous warbands today were once known by another name, their original banners buried beneath layers of history? Some of the most interesting theories suggest that some of these lost warbands might still exist, but under different identities. Maybe that warband you read about in some ancient record, the one that supposedly disappeared centuries ago, didn't vanish at all. Maybe they just changed their colors, rewrote their history, and continued fighting under a new name. It wouldn't be the first time Chaos Marines rewrote their own pasts. The Black Legion itself is proof of that. Once the Sons of Horus, they discarded their old name and their old failures, forging a new path under Abaddon. Who's to say other warbands haven't done the same? But not all lost warbands were absorbed or rebranded. Some simply ceased to exist. Not because they were destroyed, but because time itself erased them. The galaxy is vast, and war never stops. Over thousands of years, it's easy for a warband to vanish into obscurity, lost among the countless battles, crushed by the weight of history. Maybe they never suffered a great defeat. Maybe they weren't hunted down or consumed by a larger force. Maybe they just stopped mattering. They fought their wars, claimed their victories, but in the grand scheme of things, they were never important enough to be remembered. And that's what makes these lost warbands so fascinating. They were once warriors, once feared, once powerful, but history doesn't care. If you don't make an impact, if you don't carve your name deep enough into the bones of the galaxy, you fade. How many warbands have been forgotten this way? How many warriors still fight, unaware that their own history has been erased? Maybe some of them don't even remember their own origins anymore. Maybe, after centuries of battle, their true name has been lost even to them. Chaos is not kind to those who fail, nor to those who simply fall through the cracks of time. And yet, in the shadows, in the corners of war-torn space, some of these old names might still exist, waiting to be remembered, or waiting for their chance to rise again. The galaxy is vast and history is filled with gaps. Just because a warband has been forgotten doesn't mean it's truly gone. In the grim darkness of the far future, survival is often a matter of adaptation. And if there's one thing Chaos Space Marines excel at, it's refusing to die. Could some of these lost warbands still be out there, waiting for the right moment to reemerge? It's not just possible, it's almost certain. Think about it. The Imperium barely understands its own history. Records are lost, rewritten, or purged. Entire campaigns are buried under bureaucratic incompetence or deliberate censorship. If the Imperium can forget entire planetary systems, what are the chances that some Chaos warbands have simply slipped through the cracks? Some might have gone into hiding, licking their wounds, gathering strength in the depths of the Eye of Terror, or some long-forgotten war zone. Others could have been presumed dead, only to resurface centuries later under a new name, their old identities abandoned, but their hatred still burning. Some fans believe that remnants of these lost warbands still operate in the shadows, influencing events without ever revealing themselves. Maybe they've infiltrated other forces, waiting for the perfect time to break away and reclaim their former glory. Maybe they've retreated into the warp, dwelling in nightmare realms where time itself flows differently. There are stories of warbands that were last seen during the Horus Heresy, only to reappear thousands of years later, unchanged, as if no time had passed at all. Could some of these forgotten warriors be trapped in temporal anomalies, fighting battles that should have ended millennia ago? And then there's the possibility that some of these warbands never truly disappeared at all. They just changed. A warband that fell into obscurity could have been absorbed into a larger force, its warriors still fighting, but under a different banner. But what if one day, they decided to reclaim their old identity? Imagine a group of Chaos Marines, lost to history, suddenly declaring that they never truly vanished, that they were simply waiting for the right time to rise again. The Imperium would have no way to prepare for that. Some theories go even further, suggesting that some of these lost warbands might have grown stronger in their isolation. A warband that vanished into the depths of the warp might have returned as something else entirely, no longer bound by the same rules as before. Maybe they've evolved beyond mere Astartes, becoming something closer to demonic entities, still wearing the remnants of their old armor, but no longer truly human. Maybe they've been gathering artifacts, forbidden knowledge, secrets that could change the balance of power in ways no one expects. The truth is, we don't know how many lost warbands are still out there, but the idea that they're gone forever? That seems unlikely. Chaos is nothing if not persistent. Whether they come back as themselves, under a new name, or as something entirely different, the Forgotten are never truly gone. They're just waiting for the right moment to remind the galaxy why they were feared in the first place. The lost warbands of chaos are more than just forgotten names in ancient records. They are a reminder of how brutal, unpredictable, and relentless the galaxy truly is. Some were crushed by rivals, others were consumed by the warp, and some simply faded into obscurity, their stories erased by the passage of time. But in a universe where even death is rarely the end, can we really say they are truly gone? Chaos is ever-changing, and those who vanish today might return tomorrow, more twisted, more dangerous, and more vengeful than ever before. The idea of these lost warbands still lurking in the shadows is what makes them so fascinating. Unlike the Black Legion, the World Eaters, or the Death Guard, whose legacies are burned into history, these warbands are mysteries. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they were truly wiped out or if they are simply waiting for the right moment to strike again. Maybe they are still out there, surviving on the fringes of known space, watching, waiting. Or maybe they have become something else entirely, no longer recognizable as the warriors they once were. What's even more terrifying is that some of them might have learned from their mistakes. The warbands that failed, that were absorbed, that disappeared into the depths of the Eye of Terror, what if they've spent centuries growing stronger, smarter, more ruthless? What if the next great Chaos warlord to rise isn't from a known legion, but from the ranks of those once thought lost? Chaos never truly dies. It shifts, it adapts, and it waits for the perfect opportunity. And that's why the lost warbands of Chaos are more than just a historical curiosity. They are a warning. Every time a warband disappears, there's always the question, where did they go? Are they really gone? Or are they simply preparing for a return that no one will see coming? The Imperium has made the mistake of thinking enemies were defeated before, only to suffer for its arrogance. If there's one thing the Long War has taught us, it's that chaos never forgets. The lost warbands of chaos are a testament to the unforgiving nature of the galaxy. Whether they were crushed, absorbed, or simply faded into obscurity, their stories did not end. They were merely put on hold. In Warhammer 40k, nothing ever truly disappears. The past is never truly buried, and the future is never set in stone. And that means one thing: some of these warbands will return. But the real question is, in what form? A warband that vanished 10,000 years ago would not return unchanged. The warp does not allow for stagnation. It reshapes, it corrupts, it twists both flesh and purpose. If some of these warbands have been lost in the immaterium all this time, what would they even be now? Would they still resemble the warriors they once were? Or would they have become something far worse? There are theories that some lost warbands have transcended their original form entirely. Not as daemon princes, nor as simple possessed warriors, but as something even more alien. Entities that exist somewhere between mortal and immortal, no longer bound by the rules of time or space. Imagine a warband whose every member has become a living conduit of the warp, able to phase between dimensions, appearing and vanishing at will. Imagine a force that can strike at any time, in any place, and then disappear as if it were never there. Such a warband would be nearly unstoppable, not through sheer power, but through unpredictability. And unpredictability is the greatest weapon of chaos. But not all lost warbands are trapped in the warp. Some, no doubt, have been hiding in real space, buried in the ruins of dead worlds, waiting for the right moment to rise again. It is entirely possible that in the depths of the Segmentum Obscurus, beyond the reach of even the Imperium's farthest patrols, entire chaos fleets lay dormant. Ships filled with warriors long thought dead, their machines of war waiting in silence, their leaders planning their return. What happens when they wake? When the Imperium suddenly realizes that the warbands it once considered destroyed were merely sleeping? And then there's the idea that some warbands never stopped fighting at all. They just changed their methods. We assume that Chaos Space Marines always seek war. Always seek open conflict. But what if some learned to play the long game? What if they abandoned their old ways, shedding their identities, infiltrating rather than conquering? There are rumors that some lost warbands have embedded themselves into the Imperium itself, their members masquerading as rogue traitors, planetary governors, even high-ranking military officers. If that is true, then these warbands are more dangerous than any battle-hardened legion, because war can be fought with bolters and blades, but the most devastating wars are fought with lies, with corruption, with slow, insidious influence. The galaxy is a place where myths and legends become reality. The Imperium has seen the return of lost primarchs, the awakening of ancient enemies, the rise of threats that were once believed to be extinct. And so the idea that some of these lost Chaos warbands will return is not just possible, it is inevitable. The only real question is when. And when they do, they will bring with them the fury of the Forgotten, the rage of warriors who have spent centuries erased from history, overlooked, underestimated. They will not be interested in conquest or glory. They will want vengeance. And in a universe as fragile as the one the Imperium now inhabits, that vengeance could be the spark that ignites the next great war. So keep your eyes on the darkness. Watch the empty stars. Because somewhere, out there, a warband is waiting for the right time to remind the galaxy that chaos never forgets, and neither do those who serve it. The lost warbands of chaos are not just a forgotten footnote in history, they are a warning. A warning that in the galaxy of Warhammer 40k, nothing is ever truly over. Battles may be won, empires may fall, but chaos endures. And those who have vanished into the depths of war, the void, or the warp itself are not gone. They are simply waiting. The Imperium has a habit of declaring victories that are anything but. It assumes that if an enemy has not been seen in centuries, they must have been destroyed. That if a Chaos warband has not launched an attack in millennia, it must no longer exist. But that is not how Chaos works. These warriors are not part of some structured, orderly empire like the Imperium. They do not need supply chains, stable governments, or endless reinforcements. They exist in the fringes, in the places where the Emperor's light does not reach. And they thrive there. Somewhere, hidden in the void, there are ships from the Great Crusade era still adrift, filled with warriors who have been lost to history. Some of them may be dead, their bodies frozen in the silence of space, their ships nothing more than haunted tombs. But others may have found a way to survive. Perhaps entire fleets, hidden behind warp storms, are still intact, waiting for a break in reality to slip back into the galaxy. If that were true, then the next Chaos invasion may not come from the Black Legion or the World Eaters, but from the past itself. Then there is the possibility that some warbands never stopped fighting. They simply moved where no one could see them. The Imperium is vast beyond comprehension, filled with dead worlds, abandoned battlefields, and ancient ruins where no one dares to tread. How many of these places are home to forgotten Chaos Space Marines? Warriors who have never known anything but war, trapped in cycles of violence that no longer serve any grander purpose, yet unable to stop. And the scariest thing? Some of them may still have a plan. Not every warband is mindless. Some are calculating, patient, willing to wait for the right moment. What if some of these lost warbands have spent the last few millennia building their forces in secret? What if they have gathered forbidden knowledge, learned the weaknesses of their enemies, and are simply waiting for the Imperium to crumble just enough before making their move? Because make no mistake, Chaos never forgets. It does not forgive those who betrayed it, nor does it let go of old hatreds. If there are warbands out there that were once great but have since faded, you can be certain that they want nothing more than to reclaim what was taken from them. And when they return, it will not be as desperate survivors. It will be as conquerors. So if you ever hear rumors of strange warriors, of warbands with no known allegiance, of ghost fleets appearing on the edges of the galaxy, pay attention. Because those could be the first signs that the lost are returning. That Chaos is once again gathering its forgotten children. And that the Imperium is about to be reminded of something it always seems to forget. Chaos does not die. It only waits. The lost warbands of Chaos are a ticking time bomb, scattered across the galaxy, hidden in the darkest corners of war-torn space. Some may have been erased from records, some may have willingly abandoned their pasts, and others may have simply disappeared, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But make no mistake, these warbands are not gone. They are merely biding their time, The Imperium is arrogant in its belief that time erases threats. It assumes that because a Chaos Warband has not been seen in millennia, it must no longer exist. But that assumption is dangerous. Chaos does not function like the Imperium. It is not bound by the slow decay of bureaucracy or the rigid structures of human civilization. It thrives in disorder, it grows in the shadows, and it is patient. A warband that vanished 10,000 years ago could reappear tomorrow with no warning, no declaration, just war. Somewhere in the depths of the Eye of Terror, there are warbands that have evolved into something far worse than Astartes. The warp changes everything it touches, and those who spend too long within it do not emerge the same. Imagine an entire warband twisted into something barely recognizable, flesh fused with metal, bodies reshaped into grotesque living weapons, their minds fractured and remade into something inhuman. They are not dead. They are becoming something else. Something the galaxy is not prepared to face. And then there are the warbands that have not disappeared at all, but instead have been watching, studying, learning. Chaos is not just mindless bloodshed. It is ambition, deception, manipulation. Some warbands may have realized that brute force will not win the long war, and so they have changed tactics. They have embedded themselves in imperial society, hiding in plain sight, infiltrating noble houses, rogue traitor fleets, and even the Astra Militarum. Imagine an entire warband that no longer fights openly, but instead pulls the strings from behind the scenes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Some fan theories suggest that there are chaos warbands that have infiltrated even deeper, hiding not just in the Imperium, but within chaos itself. What if there are warbands that have spent centuries working against their own kind, subtly guiding rival warlords toward ruin, weakening their competition, ensuring that when the time comes for them to reveal themselves, they are the only ones left standing? Chaos is a brutal, ever-changing force, and those who can manipulate it to their advantage are the ones who will rise to power. The Imperium is facing a crisis unlike any before. The Great Rift has shattered the galaxy. Entire sectors have been cut off, and the enemies of mankind grow stronger every day. This is the perfect time for a lost warband to return. If even a fraction of these forgotten warriors are still out there, waiting, then the coming years will see the rise of forces that no one expected, striking from the darkness with weapons, tactics, and knowledge that were long thought buried. And that is what makes the lost warbands of chaos so terrifying. They are not just a relic of the past. They are the future. They are the threats that the Imperium has convinced itself no longer exist, the enemies that will return when humanity least expects them. So keep watching the shadows. Listen to the whispers of the warp, because somewhere out there, a warband that should not exist is sharpening its blades. And when it returns, it will not be looking for conquest, it will be looking for revenge. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that some of these warbands were never truly lost, just forgotten. The galaxy is a vast place, filled with dead worlds, abandoned battlefields, and entire sectors swallowed by warp storms. In such an environment, it's almost inevitable that some Chaos Space Marines, either by design or by accident, would vanish from the records of history. But what happens to those who are left behind? Some of these lost warbands may still exist, but in a form that no longer resembles what they once were. A force that was once proud, once dedicated to the service of the Dark Gods, may have been reduced to a handful of scavengers, desperately clinging to survival in some forgotten corner of the universe. They may have lost their ships, their armor, their weapons, but not their will to fight. Chaos Space Marines are not easily broken. Even without the support of their gods, even without a warlord to rally behind, they will continue to fight, because war is all they know. There are stories of warbands that have become little more than myths, spoken of in hushed whispers among the forces of chaos and the Imperium alike. Perhaps they exist in the depths of the warp, caught in an endless cycle of battle, trapped in a reality where time has no meaning. Or maybe they have forsaken the war entirely, choosing instead to live in the shadows, watching the galaxy burn from afar. Some fans believe that certain nameless bands of pirates and mercenaries may, in fact, be remnants of these lost warbands, their members having abandoned their former identities in favor of a new, more anonymous existence. But there is also the possibility that some of these warbands never truly stopped fighting. Maybe they simply changed their tactics, adapting to a galaxy that has long since forgotten them. Perhaps they have taken to manipulating events from the shadows, using cults, insurgents, and sleeper agents to spread chaos in ways far more subtle than open warfare. If even a fraction of these lost warbands still exist in some capacity, then it means that chaos is even more unpredictable than we already know. And then there's the idea that some of these warbands have simply been waiting for the right time to reveal themselves. The Imperium is more vulnerable now than it has ever been, with threats emerging from every corner of the galaxy. The Cicatrix Maledictum has split the Imperium in half, creating opportunities that did not exist before. What if, somewhere out there, an ancient warband long thought lost is preparing for a return? What if they've spent centuries growing their strength, gathering weapons, biding their time until the galaxy is weak enough for them to strike? It's almost poetic, in a way. The Imperium sees chaos as a force that is wild, uncontrolled, disorganized. But if these lost warbands are still out there, watching, learning, waiting, then maybe chaos is far more deliberate than anyone ever suspected. And if that's the case, then the real war hasn't even begun yet. The thing about the lost warbands of chaos is that their stories don't end just because they disappear from the records. Chaos itself is an entity that thrives on change, on destruction, on the cycle of death and rebirth. A warband that is forgotten today may return tomorrow, more powerful, more ruthless, and more determined than ever before. It's easy to assume that the lost warbands are gone for good, but history in Warhammer 40k has a way of repeating itself. How many times has the Imperium believed that it had destroyed a threat, only for it to rise again? How many times has chaos seemed defeated, only to return stronger than before? The truth is, no one ever truly disappears in this universe, not unless they are utterly erased, body and soul, from existence itself. And even then, the warp has a way of bringing things back. There are many theories about what happens to these lost warbands. Some believe that they have simply dissolved, their members scattered among the larger Chaos Legions. Others think that they have gone into hiding, waiting for a time when the galaxy is weak enough for them to strike. And then there are those who believe that these warbands have evolved into something else entirely, something even more dangerous than what they were before. Imagine a chaos warband that has spent centuries trapped in the warp, its members slowly mutating, their minds reshaped by the raw energies of chaos. Would they even be considered space marines anymore? Or would they be something new, something far worse? Maybe they have become demon hosts, their physical forms barely holding together as they walk the line between mortal and immortal. Or maybe they have merged with the very essence of the warp, becoming entities that can no longer be classified as anything resembling their former selves. And then there's the question of whether the Imperium even wants to remember them. The Inquisition has erased entire chapters from history before. Who's to say they haven't done the same to some of these chaos warbands? Maybe some of these lost forces didn't disappear at all. Maybe they were deliberately removed from all records, their existence denied so thoroughly that even those who fought against them barely remember their names. If that's true, then the question isn't whether these warbands still exist. It's whether they were ever truly lost in the first place. The reality is, Warhammer 40k is a universe where nothing ever truly dies. The past never stays buried. The dead don't stay dead, and chaos never forgets. These lost warbands, whatever their fate, are not gone. They are still out there, in one form or another, waiting for their time to come again. And when that time comes, the galaxy will remember them the hard way. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Forgotten Chaos Warbands, don't forget to subscribe for more Warhammer lore. There are always more mysteries to uncover, more lost stories to tell, and more forgotten warriors waiting to rise once more. The galaxy may have moved on, but chaos never truly fades, and neither do those who serve it.